She treated him like a nobody, not knowing he was a duke who would fall for her. Picture a man who has never once in his adult life been told to move. Not by a footman. Not by a minister of the crown. Not by anyone in any drawing room, dining hall, or damp English street from London to Edinburgh. A man whose very name, Lawrence Hector, the Duke of Harwick, spoken in the right company, could still a room the way a sudden frost stills a river. Slowly. Completely. With no argument from the water. Now picture Marylebone High Street on a Thursday afternoon in the autumn of 1812. Picture the rain coming sideways off the cobblestones. Picture a woman, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, flower-dusted at the cuff, entirely unbothered by the weather or by anything else, standing behind a counter with a ledger open and a quill in her hand and absolutely no patience left in her body for the evening. And picture that same man, soaking wet, slightly bewildered, dripping a small and undignified puddle onto the cleanest floor on the street, being told in a tone that brooked no discussion whatsoever that he was making a mess, that she had already mopped once, and that if he intended to stand there like a garden ornament in a storm he could at least have the decency to close the door behind him. He closed the door. He stayed. And nothing, not the season, not the street, not the considerable weight of his title, was ever quite the same again. London in the autumn of 1812 was precisely what it had always been, a city that performed. Every carriage that rolled through its streets was a statement. Every coat, every calling card, every careful tilt of a hat brim at the right moment in the right square, all of it was theater. All of it was rehearsed. And no one in that city understood the performance better than Lawrence Hector, the Duke of Harwick, who had been playing his part since he was old enough to understand what the part required of him. He had learned early. A duke does not slouch. A duke does not laugh too loudly in public, does not betray confusion, does not arrive anywhere without being expected, and does not, under any circumstances, allow himself to be caught standing in a doorway, drenched to the collar, while a shopkeeper's daughter points at his boots with a look that says she has considerably better things to do with her evening than tolerate him. Lawrence had not anticipated Marylebone High Street. He had not anticipated the rain, though the sky had been threatening it since midday. He had not anticipated the detour that brought him off his usual route and onto that particular stretch of uneven cobblestone, lined with small merchants and candlelit windows and the faint, warm smell of something sweet drifting out from behind a fogged glass pane. And he had most certainly not anticipated her. Winifred Todd was the only daughter of Arthur Todd, a provisioner who had built his reputation one honest transaction at a time, and she had been keeping the shop accounts since she was 16. She knew the weight of a ledger. She knew the price of beeswax and the going rate for crystallized ginger and exactly how long it took to mop a stone floor on a wet autumn evening. She did not know, and at that particular moment could not have cared less, that the man dripping on her clean tiles was Lawrence Hector, the Duke of Harwick, master of 3 estates, holder of a seat in the House of Lords, and regarded in the better drawing rooms of Mayfair as one of the most formidable men in England. She knew only that he was making a puddle. And so she told him so. This is the story of Lawrence Hector, the Duke of Harwick, and Winifred Todd, the provisioner's daughter, the woman who treated him like an ordinary man, and in doing so became the only person in England he could not bring himself to leave. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Lawrence Hector had attended his first formal dinner at the age of 9. He had sat at the end of a table long enough to stable horses, wearing a collar that bit into his neck, and he had watched the adults around him perform. That was the word his mother had used when she prepared him that afternoon, smoothing his jacket with both hands and speaking in the low, careful voice she reserved for instructions that mattered. "You will watch how it is done," she had said. "And next time you will do it yourself." He had watched. He had learned. And by the time he was 11 and his father was dead and the title had settled onto his shoulders like a stone garment tailored for a much larger man, Lawrence already understood the fundamental truth of his world, that the Ton was not a society. It was a production. And everyone in it knew their lines. By 31, he knew his better than anyone. He knew precisely how to enter a room, not quickly, never quickly, but with a particular unhurried deliberateness that communicated he had nowhere more important to be, which was the most powerful lie a man of his position could tell. He knew how to receive a compliment with a slight nod that acknowledged it without rewarding it. He knew which families were watching him for a slight and which were watching him for an alliance, and he knew how to give both groups exactly nothing useful while appearing to give them everything they wanted. He promenaded in Hyde Park on Tuesday and Friday mornings because that was when it was seen. He attended the correct card parties and declined the incorrect ones. He danced exactly twice at every ball, once with whoever required the honor and once with whoever required the reassurance, and he did not dance a third time, because a third dance meant something, and Lawrence had learned long ago that meaning things in public was an extraordinary liability. It was a life of considerable precision, and it was, if he was honest with himself, which he rarely had occasion to be, extraordinarily, quietly, relentlessly exhausting. The exhaustion was not the kind that showed. It was not the exhaustion of labor or grief or hardship. It was something more particular than that. It was the tiredness that comes from never once being surprised, from walking into a room and knowing within 30 seconds exactly how every person in it would speak to him, what they would want from him, and what careful, pleasant, perfectly useless thing he would say in return. From being treated, always, not as a man but as a monument, something to be admired and approached and spoken to with the particular reverence people reserve for things they do not expect to answer back in any genuinely human way. There were men who would have been contented by this. Lawrence understood that. There were men who found deep satisfaction in the frictionless operation of a life well managed, in the polished surface of a reputation without blemish, in being precisely and consistently what their world required them to be. He had tried for many years to be one of them. He had tried on the Tuesday promenades and the correct card parties and the too careful dances and the mornings in his study signing correspondence that his secretary could just as easily have signed and the evenings in drawing rooms where the conversation moved in the same well-worn grooves it had always moved in, reliable as carriage wheels in a familiar road. And still, underneath all of it, there was something restless. Something that sat quietly at the base of his chest on long evenings and said nothing, but did not go away. He would not have known what to call it if anyone had asked. No one did ask, of course. You did not ask a duke what he was missing. You assumed he was missing nothing, because he appeared to have everything, and appearances in the ton were not merely important. They were everything. It took a rainy Thursday on Marylebone High Street, a clean floor, and a woman with flower on her cuff and no interest whatsoever in his title to show Lawrence Hector what he had actually been starving for. But that comes next. He told himself the first time that it was the rain. That was the explanation. He offered the part of his mind that kept accounts, the part that noticed things and filed them away and occasionally presented them for review at inconvenient hours. He had ducked into the nearest doorway. It had been a practical decision. Any man with sense and a good coat would have done the same. The fact that it happened to be a provisioner's shop on Marylebone High Street, and that the woman behind the counter had looked at him the way one looks at a moderately inconvenient piece of furniture, was entirely incidental. He did not think about it again. Or rather, he thought about it constantly, which is a different thing entirely, and told himself each time that he was not. He thought about it on Wednesday evening at Lord Pemberton's dinner, when the woman to his left laughed at something he said that was not particularly funny, and the sound of her laughter, so eager, so carefully calibrated to delight him, settled over the table like a fine and suffocating dust. He thought about it on Thursday morning in his study, signing letters he had already read, in a house so well-ordered and so thoroughly silent that he could hear the fire thinking. And he thought about it, with a clarity that he found mildly alarming, when he found himself dressing on the following Thursday afternoon with no particular destination in mind, and then somehow, by no deliberate process he could account for, standing once again on Marylebone High Street. The rain had stopped. He had no excuse. He went in anyway. Winifred Todd did not look up immediately when the bell above the door announced him. She was weighing something at the counter, dried currants, he thought, from the smell, and she finished the weighing before she acknowledged him, which was so far outside the ordinary customs of his daily life that he very nearly laughed from the sheer novelty of it. When she did look up, there was a brief pause. Recognition, he thought. And then, remarkably, nothing. No adjustment in her posture. No sudden softening or stiffening of expression. No performance. She simply said, "You forgot your gloves last week," and held them out across the counter. He had not known they were missing. He took them. He thanked her. And because he could not think of a single rehearsed thing to say to a woman who was already looking back at her ledger, he said instead, without planning to, that the shop smelled extraordinary. She told him it was the cardamom. She told him her father ordered it from a merchant on Threadneedle Street who was, in her professional assessment, the only honest importer in the city. She said this without looking up, in the tone of someone sharing a fact rather than performing a confidence, and Lawrence stood on the customer side of the counter and felt something in his chest do a thing he could not immediately name. It was, he realized slowly, relief. Not the relief of a problem resolved or a duty discharged. Something quieter than that. Something closer to what he imagined a man felt when he had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and someone simply, without ceremony, took it from him for a moment. She spoke to him the way she would have spoken to anyone. That was all. That was the entirety of it. She did not arrange her words around his title or his consequence or the careful architecture of what he was supposed to be. She spoke to him as though he were a person who had walked through a door, which he was, and as though that were sufficient, which, he was beginning to understand, it was. He bought the cardamom. He did not need cardamom. He bought it anyway. And walking back out onto Marylebone High Street with a small paper parcel and his recovered gloves and the weak autumn sun coming through the clouds at an angle that made even the cobblestones look briefly forgivable, Lawrence Hector understood with quiet, inconvenient certainty that he was going to come back next Thursday. And the one after that. He had been given many things in his life that he did not want and was expected to receive graciously. Paintings he found ugly. Horses he found temperamental. Speeches at dinners that lasted 40 minutes longer than the food warranted, delivered by men who confused volume with eloquence. Lawrence had accepted all of it with the same measured expression, attentive, appreciative, faintly warm, because that was what the situation required, and he had long ago made his peace with the distance between what a thing was and what one was expected to say about it. He was not prepared on the third Thursday for the violet fondant. Winifred produced it without preamble, setting it on the counter between them in the manner of someone laying down evidence rather than offering a gift. It was small and deeply purple and looked, he thought, rather more confident than it had any right to be. "My father is experimenting," she said, by way of explanation. "I need an honest opinion and everyone who works here is too polite to give one." There was something in the way she said it, the complete absence of any suggestion that he might also be too polite, that politeness was even a quality she associated with him, that Lawrence found extraordinarily appealing. He picked up the fondant. He ate it. It was, without question, one of the worst things he had ever tasted. There was the violet, which was aggressive. Beneath it, something that aspired to be rose water and did not get there. Beneath that, a sweetness so dense it seemed to have architectural ambitions, underpinned by what he could only describe as the suggestion of soap. He looked at Winifred. She was watching him with her arms folded and her head tilted very slightly, in the manner of someone who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for the witness to catch up. "It's quite dreadful," he said. She exhaled as though she had been holding that breath for some time. "Yes," she said. "It is. My father believes the violet needs more time to infuse. I believe the violet needs to be removed entirely and we never speak of it again." "I think," Lawrence said carefully, "that you are correct and your father is wrong, and that the kindest thing you could do for everyone involved, including the violet, is to agree never to repeat this." She laughed. It was not the laugh he was accustomed to. It was not the performed delight of a drawing room or the careful amusement of a woman managing an impression. It was a real laugh, short and unguarded, the kind that arrives before a person has decided to allow it. And it lasted only a moment before she pressed her lips together and returned to her ledger with the composed air of someone who had not just laughed at all. But she had. And Lawrence stood on his side of the counter and understood, with a precision that surprised him, that he would eat 1,000 violet fondants for another 30 seconds of it. What struck him, walking home that evening through streets that had not changed but seemed somehow less oppressive than usual, was not the laugh itself but what had preceded it. The transaction. The simple, unstaged exchange of an honest opinion between two people who were not performing anything for each other. He thought of all the compliments he had received in his life, the careful praise of men who wanted something from him, the admiration of women who were admiring the title as much as the man who carried it, the thousand small flatteries that lined the corridors of his daily existence like decorative mirrors, pleasant to pass, reflecting nothing true. And then he thought of Winifred Todd setting a violet fondant on a counter and asking him, without ceremony or calculation, what he actually thought. She had not wanted to please him. She had wanted the truth. And in wanting the truth from him, in assuming without apparent doubt that he was capable of providing one, she had done something that almost no one in his entire life had managed. She had treated him as though his opinion was worth having. There was no agreement, spoken or otherwise, about the Thursdays. No arrangement had been made, no invitation extended, no time specified. And yet by the fourth week it had acquired the quiet certainty of a thing that simply was, the way a particular chair becomes yours in a room where no one has assigned seating, and everyone understands this without it ever being said. Lawrence arrived at 2:30. He did not plan to arrive at 2:30. He simply found each Thursday that he was on Merillion High Street at 2:30, and that Winifred was behind the counter, and that the shop smelled of whatever her father was working on that week, and that this arrangement suited him better than anything else in his calendar. They had developed, without designing it, a rhythm. She would be working when he arrived, accounts or inventory, or some small repair to the shop that she had decided not to wait for someone else to do. She would acknowledge him in the economical way she acknowledged most things, which is to say directly and without theater. He would buy something he did not need. And then, in the particular unhurried way of two people who have silently agreed that neither of them is in a rush, they would talk. Not about the ton. Not about politics or position or the careful business of who was connected to whom and what it signified. They talked the way Lawrence had almost forgotten people could talk, following the conversation wherever it went, without managing it, without steering it toward anything useful or away from anything dangerous. It was on the fifth Thursday that she told him about her father. It began with a smell, something warm and faintly spiced drifting from the back room, more complex than usual. Lawrence asked about it without thinking, and Winifred set down her quill and said it was her father's winter recipe, the one he made only between October and December, the one he had learned from his own father and refined over 30 years into something that could not be written down because the important parts of it lived in his hands rather than on paper. She said this with a particular quality in her voice that Lawrence recognized not by its sound but by its rarity. It was pride. Not the performed pride of a social boast but something quieter and more structural. The pride of a person describing something they genuinely believe in with no interest in whether the listener is impressed. Her father, she said, had built everything they had from a single room and a borrowed copper pot. He had worked hours that had no sensible name. He had kept the accounts in his head for 3 years before they could afford a ledger. And he had done all of it, she said, looking briefly at the door to the back room as though she could see through it, without once making her feel that any of it was a burden. Lawrence was quiet for a moment. Then, because she had offered him something true and he found he could not respond with anything less, he told her about his own father. Not the official version, the distinguished lineage, the seat in the Lords, the portrait in the long gallery with the expression of a man who had never once been uncertain about anything. The other version. The father who had died before Lawrence was old enough to know him as a person rather than a presence, who had left behind a title and 3 estates and a set of expectations so thoroughly embedded in the walls of the house that Lawrence had spent 20 years trying to determine which of his thoughts were his own and which were simply the house speaking. Winifred listened without interrupting. She did not offer condolences or reassurances or any of the careful sympathetic responses he had learned to expect and deflect. She simply listened, and when he finished she said, quietly, that it sounded very lonely. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to him. He did not tell her that. He looked at the counter and nodded once, and she picked up her quill, and the shop settled back into its comfortable quiet, and Lawrence thought that this, precisely this, was what he had been missing all along. He had not known she would be there. That was the thing he would return to afterwards, turning it over in the particular way one turns over something that has changed the shape of everything else. He had not known, and if he had known, he was no longer entirely certain what he would have done about it. Stayed home, perhaps. Or gone anyway, for reasons he would not have been able to articulate cleanly. Lady Whitmore's garden party was the kind of event that appeared on one's calendar the way certain obligations appeared. Inevitable, structural, non-negotiable. It was held every year in the gardens of the Cavendish Square House, which were immaculate in the way that things maintained by other people's labor are always immaculate, and it was attended by precisely the people one expected to attend it, doing precisely the things one expected them to do. Lawrence arrived at the correct time. He greeted the correct people. He accepted a glass of something cold and stood in the correct portion of the garden and performed, with the ease of long practice, the particular version of himself that this gathering required. He did not see her until he was already halfway across the lawn. She was standing near the refreshment table with a woman Lawrence didn't immediately place, a merchant's wife, he thought, someone connected to the household in some peripheral way, and she was holding a glass of lemonade and looking at the garden with the frank, unguarded curiosity she brought to most things, as though the topiary and the silk parasols and the careful geometries of Lady Whitmore's social arrangements were simply interesting phenomena she happened to be observing. She had not seen him yet. For a moment, just a moment, Lawrence considered retreating. Not from cowardice, or not only from cowardice, but from some instinct he couldn't quite name, a sense that two separate and incompatible worlds were about to occupy the same space, and that the collision would change something irreversibly. He did not retreat. He was standing in the open, and someone nearby was already moving to greet him, and the machinery of the occasion carried him forward the way it always did. It was Lady Whitmore's steward who did it. A thin man with excellent posture and a carrying voice, performing his function with crisp professional pride, announcing arrivals to no one in particular and everyone in general. His Grace, he said, the Duke of Harwick. Lawrence watched it happen. He watched Winifred Todd's head turn, the way anyone's head turns at the announcement of a title in a crowd, reflexively, without intention. He watched her eyes find him. He watched the precise moment the information arrived and was processed and rearranged everything she thought she knew, the way a key turning in a lock rearranges the relationship between a door and the room behind it. The lemonade did not fall. Her reflexes were better than the moment deserved. But the color left her face in a way that was quiet and complete, and her chin lifted by a fraction, that particular motion he had come to recognize as Winifred Todd declining to show what she was feeling, and she looked at him across Lady Whitmore's immaculate lawn with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was something more careful than anger and considerably more difficult to bear. It was the expression of a person rapidly and privately revising a set of assumptions they had trusted, the way one revises a map upon discovering that a road marked as reliable does not, in fact, exist. He crossed the lawn. He could think of nothing else to do. She let him approach. That, at least, was something. You might have mentioned it, she said, when he was close enough that only he could hear her. Her voice was even. Impressively even, given everything. Yes, he said. I might have. She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, undeceivable eyes that had never once in all their Thursdays treated him as anything other than a man standing on the customer side of a counter. Then she set down her lemonade and walked, with great dignity, in the other direction. She did not close the shop to him. He had half expected her to. It would have been entirely within her rights, and entirely consistent with the particular quality of her dignity, which was not the brittle kind that required dramatic gestures but the solid kind that simply held its shape under pressure. She could have turned the sign and drawn the curtain and he would have had no recourse whatsoever, which was a novel experience for a man accustomed to having recourse in most situations. But the following Thursday, the door was unlocked. The bell rang when he entered. And Winifred was behind the counter, as she always was, except that this time she did not look up when he came in, and the quality of her not looking up was entirely different from the comfortable, unhurried version he had grown used to. This was a considered not looking up, a deliberate one. He bought a small quantity of dried orange peel he did not need and stood on his side of the counter and waited, because there was nothing else available to him, and because, he was discovering, he was willing to wait a considerable amount of time where Winifred Todd was concerned. She spoke first, eventually, without raising her eyes from the ledger. I have been thinking, she said, in the tone of someone who has been thinking very thoroughly and has arrived somewhere uncomfortable, that I am probably a novelty. Lawrence said nothing. He had learned, over their Thursdays, that Winifred's silences were invitations to listen rather than to fill. Men in your position, she continued, still not looking up, live very large and very managed lives. And occasionally, I imagine, something small and unmanaged is refreshing. A shop on an unremarkable street. A woman who doesn't know the choreography. A place where no one is performing anything. She paused. A pleasant little holiday from the business of being a duke. She said it without bitterness. That was almost the hardest part. There was no accusation in it, no wounded pride, no demand for reassurance. She said it the way she said everything. Plainly, as though she were simply reporting an accurate observation about the world, and he was welcome to confirm or deny it at his leisure. He understood, standing there with his unnecessary orange peel, that this was the most dangerous kind of argument to answer. Not because it was mean-spirited, but because it was reasonable. Because a reasonable person, surveying the facts from the outside, might arrive at exactly the same conclusion. A duke and a provisioner's daughter and a series of Thursday afternoons that existed in complete isolation from every other part of his life. What else was one supposed to call it? You are not a holiday, he said. You don't have to. Winifred. It was the first time he had used her name directly, without the formal prefix, and it landed in the quiet shop with a weight that surprised them both. She looked up. He continued, because he had started and there was no position to retreat to that he was willing to occupy. A holiday is something a man returns from. He comes back changed in small ways that fade within a fortnight, and the life he left resumes as though he never went. That is not what this is. She looked at him steadily, with those eyes that had never once given him the courtesy of seeing only what he wanted to show. Then what is it? She asked. And there it was. The question with no rehearsed answer, in a room with no audience, from a woman who would know immediately if he reached for the convenient version rather than the true one. This was, he realized, precisely the thing he had been coming back for every Thursday, the complete impossibility of being anything other than honest in her presence. I don't know exactly what to call it, he said, but I know that every other part of my life feels considerably less real than this counter. And I know that I am not here because you are refreshing. He paused. I am here because you are the only person I have met in 20 years who makes me feel like a man rather than a monument. And that is not something I am prepared to walk away from. She held his gaze for a long moment, saying nothing. Then she looked back down at the ledger, and he saw, just briefly before she composed herself, the corners of her mouth do something that was almost a smile. Winifred Todd was, by nature and by training, a practical woman. She had grown up in a household where practicality was not a personality trait but a survival strategy, where you did not spend what you had not earned, did not plan for what you could not reasonably expect, and did not, under any circumstances, build your foundations on ground that had not been tested for its capacity to hold weight. Her father had taught her this not through speeches but through example, through 30 years of careful, honest, unglamorous work that had produced something real and lasting and entirely their own. She had applied these principles, sensibly, to most areas of her life. And she had told herself, in the weeks following the garden party, a series of very sensible stories. The first story was that it would pass. That Lawrence Hector was a man of considerable consequence and considerably more options, and that the novelty of an honest woman behind a counter would eventually exhaust itself the way all novelties did, and he would return to his estates and his card parties and his too careful dances, and she would return to her ledger, and both of them would be none the worse for it. The second story was that she did not feel what she felt, that the particular quality of a Thursday afternoon when the bell above the door announced him, the way the room seemed to sharpen slightly, the way the account columns she had been staring at for an hour suddenly looked less interesting than they had a moment before, was simply the natural response to an unexpected friendship, nothing more architectural than that. The third story was that even if she did feel what she felt, it was entirely irrelevant, because the distance between a duke and a provisioner's daughter was not merely social. It was structural. It was load-bearing. The kind of distance that did not yield to feeling, no matter how inconvenient the feeling became. She had told herself these stories with considerable discipline. They had stopped working sometime around the 5th Thursday after Cavendish Square, when Lawrence had come in out of the cold with his coat collar turned up against the November air and had immediately, upon entering, looked to the back of the shop. She understood only later that he was checking whether her father was there, wanting to know that Arthur Todd was well. Because somewhere in the weeks of their Thursdays, he had begun to care about her father, and something in that small, unperformed glance had quietly dismantled the last sensible story she had left. She did not make the decision dramatically. That was not her way. She made it the way she made most decisions. Sitting with it for several days, turning it over, examining it from the angles most likely to reveal its flaws. She considered the practicalities with genuine seriousness, because she was a practical woman and she was not going to stop being one on account of a man with good boots and an honest face. She thought about what it would mean and what it would cost and what it would require of her, and she did not pretend that any of it was simple, because it was not simple, and Winifred had no patience for pretending. And then, having examined it thoroughly from every uncomfortable angle, she arrived at the conclusion that had been waiting patiently at the end of the process all along. That he was, in fact, worth the considerable inconvenience. Not because he was a duke. The title was, if anything, the least interesting thing about him, which she suspected he would be relieved to hear. But because he was a man who had sat on the customer side of her counter for 2 months and been more genuinely himself there than he apparently managed to be anywhere else in his life. Because he had eaten a dreadful violet fondant and told the truth about it. Because he had spoken about his father in the quiet way of someone who had never been offered a safe enough space to say those things before. Because he looked at her, not at the provisioner's daughter, not at the novelty, not at the refreshing absence of deference, but at her, with the full attention of a man who found the view worth the considerable effort of getting there honestly. She was waiting behind the counter when he arrived the following Thursday. She let him buy his unnecessary purchase, dried cloves this time, and she let the shop settle into its familiar quiet, and then she looked up from the ledger and said, without preamble, that she had been thinking. He went very still in the particular way he did when something mattered. "I have decided," she said, "that you are an inconvenience I am willing to accommodate." It was not, by any conventional measure, a declaration. But Lawrence Hector looked at Winifred Todd across the worn wooden counter with an expression she had never seen on his face in all their Thursdays. Unguarded, unmanaged, entirely unperformed, and she understood that he knew exactly what it meant. "I am," he said quietly, profoundly grateful to hear it. Lawrence had faced harder things than a kitchen. He had sat across tables from men who wanted his land, his vote, his signature on documents that would benefit everyone in the room except him. He had navigated the particular cruelties of the House of Lords, where the knives were all metaphorical and none the less sharp for it. He had buried his father at 11 years old and stood at the graveside in the cold and understood, with the terrible clarity of a child who has just become the head of something, that the performance was beginning and would not stop. He had managed all of it. And yet, standing in the narrow corridor that separated the shop from the Todd kitchen on a gray Thursday morning in November, he was aware of something in his chest that felt very much like what he imagined ordinary men felt when they were frightened. He knocked. He was told to come in. Arthur Todd was at his work table, doing something precise and unhurried with a length of orange peel and a small knife. He was a compact man, broad through the shoulders, with the careful hands of someone who had spent decades making things that required patience. He looked up when Lawrence entered, and his expression was entirely neutral. Not hostile, not deferential, simply the expression of a man reserving his judgment until he had sufficient information to form one. There was a high wooden stool near the work table, the only available seat in the room. Lawrence looked at it. It was the kind of stool designed for a kitchen assistant. Low, functional, entirely without dignity. In any other context, in any other room, someone would have already sent for a proper chair. No one sent for a proper chair. Lawrence sat on the stool. Something shifted very slightly in Arthur Todd's expression. Not a smile, not yet, but the precursor to one. A small recalibration. He looked back at the orange peel and continued his work, and Lawrence understood that the interview had begun. "She tells me you've been coming in on Thursdays," Arthur said, without preamble. "For some months now," Lawrence confirmed. "She also tells me you have no practical need for cardamom, orange peel, or dried cloves, and that you buy them anyway." "That is accurate." Arthur was quiet for a moment, working the knife along the peel with a steadiness that suggested he had all the time in the world and intended to use it at his own pace. "My daughter," he said eventually, "is not a novelty. She is not an amusement. and she is not the sort of woman a man visits on Thursdays and then fits back into the ordinary shape of his life without consequence. No, Lawrence said. She is not. She has managed this shop since she was 16. Arthur's voice carried no particular emphasis, but the words had weight nonetheless, the weight of a man describing something he was proud of in the understated way of someone who considers the facts sufficient advertisement. She kept the accounts when I was ill the winter before last and said nothing about it until I was well enough to hear it. She negotiated our contract with the Threadneedle Street merchant herself because she felt I was being charged above the fair rate, and she was right. He paused. She has never once needed anyone to manage her life for her. What she needs, if she needs anything, is someone who understands that and does not attempt to change it. I would not change it, Lawrence said, for anything. Arthur looked at him then, directly, without the buffer of the orange peel, with the clear, unhurried eyes that Lawrence recognized immediately as the origin of Winifred's. The same quality of attention. The same absolute absence of performance. I know what you are, Arthur said quietly. And I know what I am. And I am not so foolish as to pretend that doesn't matter, because it does. But I am also a man who has spent 30 years learning that the only thing worth building anything on is whether a person is honest. He set down the knife. So I'll ask you once, and I'd like a plain answer. Not a duke's answer. A man's answer. Lawrence met his eyes. Are you going to take care of her? The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the shop, the bell above the door rang distantly. A customer, the ordinary world continuing its business. I intend, Lawrence said, to spend the rest of my life making certain she never has cause to doubt it. Arthur Todd looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his knife, cut the last length of orange peel with the clean efficiency of a man returning to his work, and said, without looking up, "Then you'd better stay for tea." They married on a Thursday. This was Winifred's stipulation, offered not as a romantic gesture but in the practical tone she brought to most decisions, on the grounds that Thursday was already the day that worked, and she saw no reason to introduce unnecessary complication into a calendar that had been functioning perfectly well for the better part of a year. Lawrence had agreed immediately, with a particular quality of agreement that comes not from concession but from recognizing that someone else has, once again, identified the correct answer before you got there. The ceremony was held in a small church in Wiltshire, in the village nearest to the smaller of Lawrence's 3 estates. Not the grand one, not the house with the portrait gallery and the rooms full of inherited furniture and the particular silence of a place that had been significant for too long. That house could wait. Winifred had chosen the smaller estate on the grounds that it had better light in the mornings and a kitchen that showed evidence of having been genuinely used, both of which she considered more promising indicators of a habitable life than ancestral grandeur. She was, as usual, correct. The church held perhaps 40 people. Arthur Todd sat in the front pew in a coat that Winifred had pressed herself that morning, and he watched his daughter walk toward a duke with the steady, clear-eyed composure of a man who had examined the situation from every angle and arrived at a considered peace with it. Lawrence's handful of guests, the few people in his life he trusted enough to invite to something real, sat on the other side and observed, with varying degrees of surprise, that the Duke of Harwick looked nothing like the Duke of Harwick. He looked, several of them noted privately and did not say aloud, like a man. There was no grand reception. There was a dinner, long and unhurried, at a table that was not large enough to stable horses, where the conversation went wherever it wanted and no one managed it, and Arthur Todd told a story about the winter of the borrowed copper-pot that made Winifred cover her face with both hands and made Lawrence laugh with the full, unguarded sound of someone who has stopped being careful about how laughter lands in a room. The performance, in every meaningful sense, was over. What replaced it was quieter and considerably more durable. They lived in the Wiltshire house through the winter, and Lawrence discovered that a life in which someone spoke to him plainly every morning over breakfast was so thoroughly superior to his previous arrangements that he could not account for how he had tolerated those arrangements for as long as he had. Winifred discovered that a man who had spent 20 years performing could, when given a consistent and reliable audience of one, slowly and somewhat wonderfully stop. He was not a reformed man. That was not the shape of it. He still attended what was required of him, still moved through the necessary rooms of his public life with the ease of long practice. The performance had not disappeared so much as it had been correctly relocated, out there where it was needed, rather than in the place where he actually lived. And every Thursday, without arrangement or announcement, because it had never needed either, they kept the habit. Not the shop now. The shop remained Arthur's, as had been promised, with Winifred keeping the accounts from Wiltshire by correspondence and visiting when the season allowed. The Thursday belonged to them, to the particular quality of an afternoon with no audience, no choreography, no expectation beyond the honest company of the other person. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat in the good morning light of the kitchen that had been genuinely used and said very little, and found that very little was entirely sufficient. Winifred never stopped telling him the truth. This was not a decision she made or a gift she consciously gave. It was simply who she was, as it had always been, from the first moment she had pointed at his boots and told him he was making a mess. And Lawrence, who had spent the better part of his adult life surrounded by people who told him only what they calculated he wished to hear, found that the truth, plainly delivered, across a worn counter or a breakfast table or the quiet of a Wiltshire evening, was the only thing that had ever made him feel entirely, solidly, irrevocably at home. He had walked in out of the rain. He had never really left. And that is the story of Lawrence Hector, the Duke of Harwick, and Winifred Todd, the provisioner's daughter who never once treated him as anything more or less than a man standing on the wrong side of a counter in the rain. A man who had everything the world considered worth having, and who found the one thing it had never occurred to the world to offer him, in a small shop on Marylebone High Street, on a Thursday afternoon, in the company of a woman with flower on her cuff and absolutely no interest in his title. We hope this story reminded you that the most extraordinary things rarely announce themselves, that they arrive quietly, like a man ducking out of the rain, that they ask nothing dramatic of you, only that you close the door, stay a little longer, and tell the truth when someone sets a violet fondant in front of you and asks for your honest opinion. If this story found its way to your heart today, we would love it if you would take a moment to give it a like. It tells us that these stories are worth the telling, and it helps more people find their way here. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is precisely the moment. New stories arrive regularly. Stories of love found in unlikely rooms, of people who see each other clearly when the rest of the world is busy performing. You will not want to miss a single one. And hit that notification bell so that the next time we begin with Picture the most powerful man in the room, or the most overlooked woman behind a counter, you are the very first to pull up a chair and listen. We will see you in the next one.